Drunken husband beats his wife and kids, but then several dogs show up and soon after. Rachel had long since forgotten what peace felt like. Once there had been laughter and warmth in her life. She could still remember those fleeting moments, but they felt like fragments of another world. Now, every day was a cautious navigation through an unpredictable storm, her life dictated by Mark's moods and the smell of alcohol that lingered on him when he walked through the door. The bruises and the hushed arguments were part of a life that Rachel had tried to conceal from her children. She wanted them to feel safe, to believe that their home was a sanctuary. But as they grew older, their eyes began to see through her forced smiles and whispered reassurances. She saw the fear mirrored in their expressions each night, and it broke her heart to know that she couldn't protect them from the truth. On the outside, their home looked like any other on the block, a modest house with a small, unkempt yard. But the people in the neighborhood had come to learn that appearances could be deceiving. Neighbors rarely spoke about the sounds that filtered through the walls at night, the shouting and the occasional crash. Silence was easier, less complicated. And so Rachel endured it alone, carrying the weight of her fears with no one to share them. Yet, in her solitude, Rachel found small moments of unexpected comfort. In recent months, stray dogs had begun to linger near the edge of her yard. They were a ragtag group of scruffy mutts, mostly thin and ragged, but one dog stood out, a large German shepherd with a piercing gaze that seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. She noticed him most often on the nights when things were worst, when Mark's rage filled every corner of the house. It was as if the dog sensed her fear and lingered close by, silently watching over her. Rachel named him Shadow in her mind, though she'd never dared to approach him. Shadow stayed just out of reach, his watchful eyes observing her from the darkness. He would appear unexpectedly, sitting quietly near the porch steps, or standing guard under the thin trees that lined the yard. Rachel found herself looking for him, grateful for his presence, though she couldn't explain why. In the midst of her fear, there was a strange comfort in knowing that someone, or something, was there, a silent protector she hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly harrowing argument, Rachel stepped outside to catch her breath, her heart still pounding. She closed her eyes, trying to find a moment of calm in the cool night air. When she opened them, she saw Shadow sitting at the edge of the yard, his eyes fixed on her, unmoving. Rachel took a cautious step toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "Hey there, boy," she murmured as though speaking too loudly might scare him off. Shadow didn't move. He just watched her, his gaze steady and unwavering, as if he understood everything she was going through. Rachel's heart tightened, and she almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A stray dog, her only ally in a world that had turned against her. But there was something in those eyes, a depth that she couldn't ignore, a silent promise of protection that lingered even after she went back inside. The next morning, Mark's anger was like a dark cloud hanging over the household. He was in one of his moods, the kind that made everyone walk on eggshells, afraid to do anything that might set him off. Rachel moved quietly through the house, doing her best to stay out of his path, to shield the children from his temper. But it was an impossible task, like trying to stop a storm with her bare hands. As she went to check on the kids, Rachel glanced out the window and saw Shadow again. He was lying under the tree watching the house with the same intense focus. The sight of him gave her a flicker of hope, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. But she knew that hope was a fragile thing in her world, a delicate light that could be snuffed out at any moment. That night, as the children huddled in their room and Rachel prepared herself for another night of uncertainty, she caught herself looking for Shadow's figure outside the window. And there he was, standing watch, his eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. For a brief moment, Rachel allowed herself to believe that he was there for her, that his presence was a sign that things might one day change. But deep down, a part of her still felt trapped, as though her life was an endless cycle of fear and survival. As long as Mark was there, she knew she would continue to live this way, cautious, tense, and waiting for the next storm to hit. Still, as she closed her eyes that night, Rachel held on to the memory of Shadow's gaze, the way he'd seemed to see right through her pain. She clung to that silent connection, that small glimmer of strength in a world that had taken so much from her. And perhaps, in the depths of her heart, she began to feel a tiny, unspoken hope. A hope that things might one day change even if she didn't yet know how. The sound of the front door slamming against the frame was enough to make Rachel's heart skip a beat. She glanced at the clock. It was late, even later than usual. She had hoped Mark wouldn't come home tonight, that maybe he'd find somewhere else to sleep off his anger. But here he was, his footsteps heavy and uneven as he stumbled through the entryway, a low mumble of curses filling the silence. Rachel quickly signaled to her children, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the living room, reading. Without a word, they slipped into their shared bedroom, closing the door softly behind them. She waited, listening as Mark dropped his things onto the floor with a heavy thud and stumbled into the kitchen. She could hear him rummaging through the cabinets, likely searching for the last bottle of whiskey he'd hidden away. Her entire body was tense, every muscle wound tight as she prepared herself for whatever he might do next. She heard the clinking of a glass, the distinct glug of liquid pouring, and then a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The silence was the worst part. It was like the calm before a storm, a quiet that felt heavy, as though it held the promise of something terrible. Rachel glanced out the window, her heart pounding, and saw the dark shape of Shadow, the German shepherd, sitting in his usual spot near the edge of the yard. His eyes caught the dim glow from the streetlight, reflecting an eerie brightness. She felt a strange sense of comfort at the sight of him, a reminder that, somewhere out there, she had an ally, even if he was just a dog. The silence broke with the sound of footsteps as Mark walked back into the living room. His eyes were glazed, his expression twisted with anger and resentment. He looked at Rachel, and she knew that he was looking for a target, someone to take his frustration out on. "Where's my dinner?" he slurred, his voice laced with irritation. Rachel swallowed, forcing herself to remain calm. I wasn't sure when you'd be home. I can heat something up for you if you'd like." Mark sneered, shaking his head as though her words were a personal insult. "Of course you wouldn't know," he muttered, his voice filled with contempt. "You're useless. Always have been." Rachel held her breath, bracing herself as he moved closer. She kept her gaze low, not wanting to meet his eyes, not wanting to provoke him further. But it didn't matter. Mark was already in one of his moods, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface, looking for an excuse to explode. Before she knew it, he grabbed her arm, pulling her close. The smell of alcohol was strong on his breath, and she struggled not to recoil. "What do you even do around here, huh?" he hissed, his grip tightening. "Just sit around and act like a victim?" Rachel fought to keep her voice steady, to hide the fear that threatened to overtake her. "Please, Mark," she whispered. "The kids, they'll hear you." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the room. "Let them hear. Maybe they should know what their mother's really like. Maybe they should understand just how useless you are." A surge of anger flared within her, a spark of defiance that she tried to push down. She couldn't afford to stand up to him, not now, not when her children were so close. But in the back of her mind, she remembered the silent presence of Shadow outside, the way he had watched over her, as if sensing her pain. Mark's grip on her arm tightened, his fingernails digging into her skin. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. "Just because you're their mother, you think you can do whatever you want?" Rachel winced as his grip intensified, the pain sharp and insistent. But she stayed quiet, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wouldn't give him that power. She focused on her breathing, trying to stay calm, to remind herself that this would pass, just like every other night. But then Mark's anger shifted, his gaze drifting toward the hallway where the children's room was. His eyes narrowed and Rachel felt her stomach drop. She moved quickly, stepping in front of him, blocking his path. "Leave them out of this," she said, her voice firmer than she'd intended. Mark's expression darkened, and for a brief moment, Rachel thought he might actually hit her. His hand twitched, his face twisted with rage. But then, out of nowhere, there was a noise, a sharp, insistent scratching at the front door. They both froze, their heads turning toward the sound. Mark frowned, distracted. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, releasing his grip on her arm as he stumbled toward the door. Rachel's heart raced as she watched him move away, a mixture of relief and confusion flooding through her. The scratching continued, persistent and steady, as though something, or someone, was demanding entry. She dared a glance out the window and saw a cluster of shadows near the porch steps. Her heart leapt as she recognized the familiar form of Shadow, flanked by several other dogs, all of them staring intently at the front door. Mark swung the door open, looking around with a bewildered expression. The dogs stood their ground, their eyes fixed on him, unmoving. There was something almost eerie about the way they watched him, as though they knew exactly who he was, exactly what he was capable of. "What the hell are you mutts doing here?" he shouted, his voice slurred with drunken rage. He took a step forward, waving his arms in an attempt to scare them off, but the dogs didn't flinch. They stood their ground, their gazes unwavering, their silent defiance filling the air with a tension that made Rachel's skin prickle. For a moment, Rachel felt a spark of hope, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long that it almost felt foreign. She looked at Shadow, his gaze locked on Mark, his stance protective and unyielding. She realized with a sudden clarity that she wasn't as alone as she had always thought. Mark cursed, slamming the door shut with a finality that made Rachel flinch. But as he staggered back toward her, she felt a newfound strength building inside her. A strength that whispered to her that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe it was only the beginning. The next morning, Rachel woke to a quiet house. Mark had left early, his keys and wallet missing from the entryway table. She breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for a few hours of peace. Her arms still ached where his fingers had dug into her skin, the bruise already darkening, a cruel reminder of the night before. But there was something else, a stirring deep within her, a faint but growing strength that she hadn't felt in a long time. As she walked to the kitchen to make breakfast for her children, she glanced out the window, searching for the familiar shadowed figure that had given her comfort through the storm. Shadow was there, lying on the grass near the porch steps, watching her through the window with those intense eyes. A small flicker of a smile crossed her face as she met his gaze. She couldn't explain why, but knowing he was there made her feel less alone. Later that morning, as she walked her children to the school bus, her neighbor and friend Ellen came outside, waving her over with a warm smile. Ellen was a kind woman, a few years older than Rachel, and had always been someone Rachel could trust. She often stopped by to chat, bringing homemade bread or freshly baked cookies for Rachel's children. But today, Ellen's expression was different. Her smile was laced with concern, her eyes searching Rachel's face for signs she could never admit aloud. "Honey, are you all right?" Ellen asked gently, her gaze lingering on the bruise peeking out from under Rachel's sleeve. Rachel hesitated, instinctively tugging her sleeve down to hide the mark. She felt the familiar instinct to dismiss, to pretend everything was fine. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of Shadow's unwavering gaze, or the knowledge that Ellen, at least, cared enough to notice. She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands before speaking. It's been rough lately," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellen reached out, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to go through this alone, Rachel. If you need help, I'm here. We all are." Rachel's throat tightened as she heard the sincerity in Ellen's words. But she was afraid. Afraid of what Mark would do if he found out she'd been talking to someone, if he thought she was trying to leave. "I don't know if I can leave," she said softly, her voice wavering. He'd never let me go." Ellen's face softened, a mixture of empathy and determination flickering in her eyes. "Rachel, you deserve better than this. And so do your children. If you ever decide to make a change, know that I'll support you. And you're stronger than you think." Rachel nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Ellen's words gave her strength, the same quiet resilience she had felt when Shadow had appeared, watching over her in the night. For the first time in years, she felt a faint glimmer of hope, a small but powerful belief that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. As she walked back to the house, Rachel noticed Shadow lying in his usual spot. This time she didn't hesitate. She knelt down on the porch steps, reaching out a hand toward him. Shadow stood up and walked toward her, his movements calm and assured. He sniffed her hand before nudging it gently with his nose, a silent gesture of comfort that made her heart ache with gratitude. "You're my guardian, aren't you?" she murmured, running her hand through his thick fur. Shadow's eyes met hers, his gaze steady and full of an understanding she couldn't quite explain. For the first time, she let herself believe that his presence wasn't just coincidence, that maybe, in some strange way, he had chosen to watch over her, to be her silent protector in a world that had otherwise turned its back. Over the next few days, Rachel's resolve began to grow. She found herself planning, thinking about what she might need if she ever decided to leave. She started setting aside small amounts of money, stashing them in a hidden pocket of her purse. She packed a bag with essentials, hiding it in a closet just in case. The idea of leaving still terrified her, but the fear of staying was beginning to feel even more suffocating. As she prepared her small escape plan, she found herself looking for Shadow more often. He was there almost every night, lying in his usual spot under the tree, watching the house with a quiet vigilance. Occasionally he was joined by other dogs, scruffy, mismatched mutts who seemed to follow his lead, sitting or lying nearby as though they too were part of a larger purpose. One evening, as Rachel finished putting her children to bed, she heard a gentle scratching at the front door. Her heart raced, but she opened it slowly, finding Shadow waiting outside, his gaze soft and unthreatening. Behind him stood a few other dogs, each one watching her with quiet, knowing eyes. She stepped outside, glancing around to make sure Mark hadn't come home early. She knelt down, looking at the dogs that had gathered around her porch. "Thank you," she whispered as if they could understand her words. Thank you for watching over us." Shadow stepped closer, nudging her hand with his nose, as though reassuring her that he would continue to protect her. The other dogs watched in silence, their calm presence a balm to her frayed nerves. In that moment, Rachel felt a surge of courage, a belief that she wasn't as powerless as she had once thought. These animals, these guardians, were here for a reason. The days passed in a fragile peace, Rachel's preparations growing more intentional with each passing moment. She didn't know when she'd have the courage to act, but she knew that, when the time came, she wouldn't be alone. One morning, as she packed her children's lunches, she felt a small spark of defiance. She looked out the window where Shadow sat, ever vigilant, and she realized that she didn't have to face her fears alone. She had allies, some visible, others in her heart. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she finally believed that there was a way out, a path that could lead her and her children to safety. With every small act of preparation, with every glance at her loyal guardian, Rachel felt her strength grow. She was ready. Or, at the very least, she was getting there. And in her heart, for the first time in years, she felt a steady, unyielding hope. The day had been tense from the moment Mark returned. Rachel sensed it in the way he moved, in the scowl that darkened his face as he stomped through the house, muttering angrily under his breath. He seemed even more volatile than usual, as if some unseen burden was pressing down on him, amplifying his anger. Rachel tried to keep the children out of his way, urging them to play quietly in their room, her nerves fraying with every passing minute. As evening approached, Rachel's dread grew. She hadn't seen Shadow all day, and a part of her longed for his quiet presence. Without him nearby, she felt exposed, vulnerable. She tried to reassure herself that he'd be there tonight, but doubt crept in. For all she knew, he could have wandered off, leaving her to face this alone. Just after dinner, Mark's temper flared. He had started drinking heavily again, his glass never empty as he paced the kitchen. Rachel stayed silent, hoping that if she kept her head down, he might leave her and the children alone. But then, out of nowhere, Mark began shouting, slamming his fist on the table. "What's the point of any of this?" he snarled, his voice thick with bitterness. "You just sit here looking at me like you're better than me?" Rachel's heart raced as he directed his anger at her, his words cutting through her like knives. She knew better than to respond, but something inside her rebelled, a spark of anger rising to meet his accusations. She fought to keep it contained, knowing that any response would only make things worse. But then Mark's gaze shifted toward the hallway where the children's room was, and Rachel felt her blood run cold. He took a step toward their door, and without thinking, Rachel moved in front of him, blocking his path. Her voice trembled, but she stood firm. "Leave them out of this, Mark." His face contorted with rage, and for a terrifying moment, Rachel thought he might actually hit her. He lifted his hand, his fist clenched, and she braced herself. But before he could strike, there was a sound, a faint scratching at the front door, almost too quiet to hear over the pounding of her heart. Mark froze, his anger momentarily interrupted. He glanced toward the door, frowning. The scratching continued, steady and insistent, as though something was demanding entry. Rachel's pulse quickened, hope flickering to life as she remembered the dogs, their quiet vigilance and unwavering loyalty. Mark scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Those damn dogs," he muttered, staggering toward the door. "They're pests just like you?" Rachel watched, holding her breath as he flung the door open. Shadow stood there, his eyes locked on Mark with an intensity that sent a chill down Rachel's spine. But Shadow wasn't alone. A handful of other dogs sat beside him, scruffy, mismatched mutts, each one silent and unmoving, their eyes trained on Mark. They stood like a silent army, their gazes dark and unyielding, as if they knew exactly what they were facing. Mark glared at them, waving his arms as he tried to shoo them away. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice slurred with drink. But the dogs didn't move. They simply sat there, staring at him with an eerie calm that unsettled even Mark. He hesitated, glancing back at Rachel with a look that mixed confusion and anger. "Did you do this?" he demanded, his voice thick with suspicion. Rachel shook her head, her heart pounding as she met Shadow's gaze. There was a fierceness in his eyes, a silent promise that she wasn't alone. She felt a surge of courage, a determination she hadn't known she possessed. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "They're here because they know what you are," she said, her tone defiant. "They know what you've done." Mark sneered, his anger reigniting. "You're insane," he spat. But there was a hint of fear in his eyes as he looked at the dogs, their steady gazes never leaving him. Shadow took a step forward, his stance protective, his eyes flashing in the dim light. The other dogs followed his lead, moving as one, their silent unity a clear warning. Mark stumbled back, his bravado faltering as he realized they weren't going to leave. They were here for Rachel and they weren't going to back down. In that moment, Rachel felt something shift within her. She was done being afraid. She was done letting Mark control her, letting him dictate her life through fear and intimidation. She took another step forward, her voice growing stronger. "You can't hurt us anymore," she said, her words ringing with a conviction she hadn't known she possessed. "I won't let you." Mark looked at her, his face a twisted mask of anger and disbelief. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Shadow let out a low, menacing growl. The sound filled the air, a warning that was impossible to ignore. The other dogs joined in, their growls a symphony of defiance, a promise of protection that hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Mark looked afraid. Truly afraid. He took a step back, his gaze darting between Rachel and the dogs, his bravado crumbling as the reality of the situation sank in. Rachel held her ground, her heart pounding as she met his gaze. "Leave," she said, her voice steady. "And don't come back." Mark hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. But the dog's unyielding stares left him no choice. With a final glare, he turned and stumbled out the door, slamming it behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was a silence filled with triumph, a silence that spoke of a battle won. Rachel stood there, her body trembling as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. She had stood up to him, had found the courage to defy him, to claim her life as her own. And she hadn't been alone. Shadow and his companions had been there, silent guardians who had protected her when no one else could. She knelt down, reaching out to Shadow, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand trembling as she stroked his fur. Shadow looked up at her, his eyes softening, as though he understood the depth of her gratitude, the magnitude of what they had just achieved together. The other dogs gathered around her, their eyes warm and loyal, their presence a reminder that she wasn't alone, that she had allies who would stand by her through anything. In that moment, Rachel knew that things would never be the same. She had found her strength, had reclaimed her life, and with Shadow and his companions by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. As she stood there, surrounded by her unlikely protectors, Rachel felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The fear that had once consumed her was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. She had been to the depths of despair, had faced the darkness head-on, and now, finally, she was free. She looked down at Shadow, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "We're safe now," she said, the words a promise to herself, to her children, and to the dogs who had saved them. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel truly believed it. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet Rachel had always longed for. After Mark had stormed out, she'd half expected him to return with more fury than ever, but as the hours turned into days, it became clear that he wasn't coming back. At least not yet. The knowledge brought her relief, a calm that felt foreign after so many years of tension. For the first time she could move through her own home without fear. But she knew better than to assume this was over. Mark would come back eventually, she could feel it, a dark cloud on the horizon. This was only a temporary reprieve, a brief moment of peace before the storm. She needed to act to make sure that when he did return, she and her children would be long gone. In the days that followed, Rachel's resolve only grew stronger. She doubled down on her preparations, quietly gathering essentials, setting aside a little more money each day. Her children sensed the shift in her, though she hadn't told them everything. They knew, perhaps better than anyone, what their father was capable of, and they seemed to understand that something important was happening. One evening, as she was tucking them into bed, her daughter, Lily, looked up at her with wide, serious eyes. "Mom, are we leaving?" Rachel's breath caught, but she managed a nod, giving Lily's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're going to go somewhere safe." Lily's face softened, relief evident in her gaze. "Will the dogs come too?" Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "They'll be with us in spirit," she replied, glancing out the window to where she knew Shadow would be, watching over them. As the days turned to weeks, Shadow and his small band of companions were always near, a silent reminder of the strength Rachel had found within herself. They seemed to know that something was happening, that a change was coming. Shadow, in particular, never left her side for long. Whenever she felt a flicker of doubt, all she had to do was look out the window and see him standing there, his presence a steady source of courage. One afternoon, Rachel made her final preparations. She packed a bag for herself and her children, filled with clothes, documents, and a few precious belongings. She left it by the front door, ready for the moment they would finally leave. As night fell, Rachel found herself standing on the porch, gazing out at the darkening sky. Shadow was there as always, sitting silently near the steps. She walked over to him, kneeling down to meet his gaze. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tomorrow we're leaving?" Shadow's eyes held hers, his expression calm and knowing. It was as if he understood everything she was saying, as if he knew that this was the moment she'd been building toward all this time. She reached out, running her hand through his fur, feeling the strength beneath his calm exterior. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Shadow leaned into her touch, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. In his gaze, Rachel found the courage she needed. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She didn't know where they would go, didn't know what the future held. But she knew that she couldn't stay here any longer, that she couldn't allow her children to live in fear. That night, as she lay in bed, Rachel found herself unable to sleep. Her mind was a whirl of thoughts, each one carrying a blend of fear and hope. She glanced out the window, where the faint outline of Shadow was visible in the moonlight, his form a comforting presence in the dark. Then suddenly there was a sound, a faint creak from the hallway, a sound that sent her heart racing. She sat up, her body tensing as she listened. Her hand reached instinctively for the phone beside her bed, her fingers hovering over the keypad. The creak sounded again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear, her mind racing through a dozen possible scenarios. Was it Mark? Had he somehow slipped back into the house without her noticing? She moved silently toward the bedroom door, peeking out into the dark hallway. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she could make out a shadowy figure moving down the hall. It was Mark. A surge of fear shot through her, but she forced herself to stay calm, her mind racing. She knew she had to act quickly to get the children and leave before he could do anything. Her hand tightened around the doorknob, her mind going through every possible escape route. Just as she was about to move, she caught sight of something outside the window. Shadow standing with his pack of dogs, all of them staring intently at the house. Their eyes were fixed on Mark's shadowy form, and Rachel felt a wave of strength surge through her. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. With newfound resolve, she stepped into the hallway, her voice low but firm. "Mark," she said, her tone steady. "You need to leave." He turned to face her, his expression twisted with anger. "This is my house," he snarled. "You don't get to tell me what to do." But Rachel didn't back down. "You're wrong," she replied, her voice unwavering. "This isn't your home anymore." Mark took a step toward her, but before he could get any closer, a low growl echoed from outside. The sound was deep, resonant, filled with a quiet menace that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. Mark froze, his gaze flicking toward the window. Shadow stood there, his stance protective, his eyes fixed on Mark with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Rachel took a step back, her heart racing. She didn't know how, but she felt an unbreakable bond with Shadow and the dogs. They were her protectors, her allies. And she knew they would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Mark looked back at her, his bravado crumbling as he realized he was outmatched. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice tinged with fear. But Rachel held her ground, her gaze steady. "Yes, it is." With a final look of contempt, Mark turned and left, his footsteps fading into the night. Rachel watched him go, a sense of finality settling over her. She knew that this was the end, that she and her children were finally free. As she stood there, Shadow approached, his eyes warm and steady. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around him, her voice choked with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing that no words could ever fully capture the depth of her gratitude. In that moment, Rachel knew that she had found her strength. She had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side, free at last. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light across the room, Rachel felt a newfound calm settle over her. She had faced Mark, had stared down her fears, and had emerged stronger than she ever thought possible. But she knew that she couldn't linger here. She and her children needed to leave before Mark returned. She was determined to make this final push for freedom. She moved quietly through the house, gathering her essentials one last time, her mind clear and focused. She left a note for the children, explaining that they'd be leaving for good and that it was time to begin a new chapter. She could feel their silent agreement in every movement. They were ready to leave the past behind. But just as she was finishing, a sound shattered the morning stillness, the unmistakable rumble of Mark's truck pulling into the driveway. Rachel froze, her heart pounding as fear surged through her. She hadn't expected him back so soon. She thought they would have more time to leave without confrontation. But now, standing by the front door with her bags packed, she knew there was no turning back. Her hand tightened on the doorknob as Mark stumbled out of his truck, his expression dark and volatile. She could see it in his eyes, the rage, the bitterness, the need to assert control. He wasn't about to let her leave so easily. As he approached the house, Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of resolve rise within her. She wouldn't let him intimidate her, wouldn't let him force her back into submission. She had come too far to back down now. Just as he reached the porch, a low, menacing growl echoed from the side of the house. Rachel glanced over and saw Shadow standing there, flanked by his loyal pack. Their eyes were locked on Mark, their stances protective and unyielding. It was as if they understood the gravity of the moment, as if they knew that this was the final stand. Mark stopped in his tracks, his gaze shifting between Rachel and the dogs. "You think a bunch of mutts are going to scare me?" He sneered, but Rachel could see the hint of fear in his eyes. He took a step forward, his bravado faltering as the growls grew louder, more insistent. Rachel held her ground, her voice steady and unafraid. "They're here for a reason, Mark. And they're not going to let you hurt us anymore." Mark's face twisted with rage, but he didn't dare move closer. The dogs formed a barrier between him and the house, their growls low and threatening, their eyes never leaving him. Shadow took a step forward, his gaze cold and unyielding, his entire stance a warning that Mark was no longer welcome here. "You're insane," Mark muttered, his voice shaking slightly. "You can't keep me away from my own family." Rachel met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that left him speechless. "This family doesn't belong to you anymore. We're done living in fear." For a moment, Mark looked as though he might argue, his mouth opening in a sneer. But before he could say another word, Shadow let out a powerful bark, the sound echoing across the yard. The other dogs followed suit, their voices joining in a fierce, unified chorus that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. Mark took an involuntary step back, his face pale with anger and fear. He tried to steady himself, but the power in Shadow's gaze, in the collective presence of the dogs, was undeniable. They stood as a force he couldn't hope to overcome, a silent declaration that his control over Rachel and her family was over. Rachel felt a surge of triumph as she watched Mark falter. She knew that this was the end, that she was finally free of him. Without another word, she turned, gathering her children and stepping off the porch, past Mark and into the open air. Shadow and the dogs followed her closely, their loyal presence a silent reassurance. Mark watched them go, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He had lost, and there was nothing he could do to change it. As they walked away, Rachel felt the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. She was leaving behind the pain, the fear, the life that had trapped her for so long. And as she walked, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that her life could be more than survival, that she could finally begin to live. The road stretched out before them, a path that led to freedom and healing. Shadow walked beside her, his eyes bright and steady, his loyalty unwavering. Rachel knew that he and the other dogs would always be with her, a reminder of the courage she had found, the strength she had reclaimed. She didn't look back. The air was still as Rachel walked away from the house that had held so many memories, both bitter and sweet. Her children walked closely beside her, sensing the weight of the moment. Shadow and his pack padded silently alongside them, forming a protective circle as they made their way down the road. Rachel felt a strange sense of calm settle over her, a sense that finally she had control over her own life. As they moved farther from the house, Rachel's thoughts drifted to everything that had brought her to this moment. She had spent so many years bound by fear, each day a careful balance of survival and compromise. But now for the first time she felt truly free. She glanced down at her children, who looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. She knew that this freedom wasn't just for her, it was for them too. The journey to the small, quiet town nearby felt surreal. Every step was filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension, as though she were moving between two worlds, the life she had left behind and the life she was about to create. The dogs continued to follow, a silent escort that reminded her of the strength she had found within herself, the resilience that had carried her through the darkest times. When they reached the town's edge, Rachel found herself drawn to a small park, a quiet spot with benches beneath tall, sheltering trees. She led her children to one of the benches, sitting down and pulling them close. The dogs settled around them, forming a silent perimeter as Rachel took a deep breath, letting the reality of their new freedom wash over her. Her son looked up at her, his expression a mix of curiosity and relief. "Are we going to stay here, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft. Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with love for her children. "For now, sweetheart," she replied. "We'll stay here until we find the right place to call home." Her daughter snuggled closer, her small hand slipping into Rachel's. "Are the dogs going to stay with us too?" Rachel looked over at Shadow, his gaze steady and unwavering. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the loyalty and protection he had offered, the silent support that had given her the courage to break free. "I think they'll always be with us," she murmured, her voice filled with warmth. "One way or another." For a while they sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The park was peaceful, a quiet refuge that seemed to welcome them with open arms. Rachel felt the tension in her body begin to ease, replaced by a calm she hadn't known in years. She was free to start anew, to rebuild her life on her own terms, free from fear and control. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light across the town, Rachel knew it was time to find a more permanent place to rest. She gathered her children, giving one final nod of gratitude to the dogs who had guided them here. Months passed, and the echoes of their old life faded into distant memories. Rachel and her children had settled into a small, cozy house on the edge of town. It wasn't grand or fancy, but it was safe and it was theirs, a place where they could laugh, breathe freely, and simply be themselves without fear. Rachel had found work at a nearby community center, where her warmth and strength quickly endeared her to the people there. She spent her days helping others, listening to their stories and offering them the same kindness she had once needed. In doing so, she found healing, a sense of purpose that filled her days with joy and gave her a reason to keep moving forward. Her children adjusted to their new school, slowly blossoming into their own as they made friends and discovered the simple joys of childhood that had been denied to them for so long. They laughed more freely now, their eyes brighter with each passing day. The weight of their old life no longer burdened them. They were beginning to thrive in a way Rachel had always hoped for but had scarcely dared to imagine. But the most unexpected part of this new chapter was the dogs. Shadow, true to his name, stayed by their side, his loyalty unwavering. He became a part of their lives, following the children to school in the mornings and waiting patiently at the end of the day to walk them home. His presence was a constant source of comfort, a reminder of the journey they had shared and the strength that had brought them here. The other dogs visited often, though they came and went as they pleased. Each one had its own personality, its own way of interacting with Rachel and her children. Some were playful, others calm and watchful, but all of them seemed to sense that they had become part of something greater, a family forged through resilience and love. One crisp autumn evening, as Rachel and her children sat around the small fire pit in their backyard, Shadow lay nearby, his watchful eyes reflecting the firelight. Her son looked over at her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. "Mom," he began, his voice thoughtful, "do you think Shadow knew that we needed him?" Rachel smiled, looking down at the loyal dog lying by her side. "I think he did," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "I think he knew exactly what we needed." Her daughter leaned against her, her eyes bright with curiosity. "And what about the other dogs? Do you think they'll always come back?" Rachel nodded, pulling her children close. "Yes," she murmured. "They're part of our family now. They may wander, but they'll always find their way back to us." As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Rachel felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She thought of everything they had endured, the darkness they had left behind, and the life they had now. This was their fresh start, their new beginning, and it was filled with more love and joy than she could have ever imagined. And in her heart, she knew that Shadow and his pack had given her something she could never repay, the courage to reclaim her life, and the unwavering loyalty that had carried her through the hardest of times. Together they had found a new home. And for the first time, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be.